Hey, I'm Hassan and welcome to Retro Revive. Today I have an iPad 2nd generation. Before I get into testing what it can do in 2023, I'd greatly appreciate if you subscribe as it helps out the channel a bunch and motivates me to continue. Thanks, and on with the video. iPads. Don't worry about the last scene, they all survived, it's okay. Hey, I'm Hassan and welcome to Retro Revive. Today I have an iPad 2nd generation. This iPad was released March 2nd, 2011 and was the first iPad to get things rolling for Apple. Hold on, let's get to a more traditional setup. Much better. As I was saying, the original iPad was released on April 3rd, 2010, and while it was a success, it was merely a test product for Apple. It lacked any cameras and was a bit underspec'd. Mainly, it had half the RAM of the iPhone 4, which was released the same year. It actually shared the same amount of RAM with the iPod Touch 4th generation, which had 256 megabytes of RAM. And despite this, it was stopped on iOS 5, while the iPod was stopped on iOS 6. These facts prove that the original iPad was not a device Apple really wanted to invest their resources in, but rather a device they wanted to see if general consumers would purchase. Apple's test had worked because the original iPad sales figures were so successful it warranted a 2nd generation. This new iPad brought forth many innovations to the table, and before I continue to show you shots of my iPad, please mind the hideous case on it. It's covering a pretty nasty crack on the bezel and a personal engraving on the back. Yeah, unfortunately I had no better solution. As I was saying, compared to the original iPad, it was noticeably thinner from 0.5 inches to 0.38 inches, lighter from 1.5 pounds to 1.3 pounds, had a front-facing and rear camera that was capable of video recording at 720p 30fps for the rear and 640x480 aka VGA quality at 30fps for the front. The most impressive part of the iPad was that it had a much more capable CPU. It had the Apple A5 chip, which had 2 cores instead of 1 like the original, and twice the RAM of the original, going from 256 megabytes to 512 megabytes. It was double the power at the same price, starting at $499. So that brings us to today. Is the iPad 2nd generation worth it in 2023? Let's start off with the build. Its aluminum back feels nice to the touch, and it's easy to hold and use. It isn't even that heavy, even to today's standards either. I compared it to my Galaxy Tab S8, and they feel about the same in my hands. For reference, the S8 is 1.1 pounds, which is slightly lighter than the iPad at 1.3 pounds. One thing that hasn't aged as gracefully is the display. At an absolutely incredibly magnificent resolution of 1024x768, this non-retina display is not wowing anybody today. For general use, it's not bothersome, but you will notice pixelation. And lastly, good luck fixing the iPad because it has an iFixit score of 2 out of 10, making it incredibly hard to repair. Now let's talk about iOS. This iPad has an Apple A5 chip, and one thing about the Apple A5 chip is that it is notoriously slow on iOS 9, which all of its devices were discontinued on. It is in fact one of the slowest possible iOS experiences, if not the slowest. But it is possible to both downgrade and dual boot devices that have an Apple A5 chip. I've downgraded mine to iOS 6, which is incredibly snappy and barely uses any battery life. iOS 6 versus 9 on the A5 feels like night and day, and it honestly feels new after the downgrade. Now for app support. In 2023, iOS 6 is not really going to support anything off the App Store, which kind of forces you to jailbreak and sideload applications yourself. If you stick to iOS 9, you might have some luck downloading some apps off the App Store from your purchase section, but that list of apps is slowly dwindling. If you use iOS 6, you might notice that the App Store is surprisingly responsive, but if iOS 9's app catalog is trickling down, iOS 6 is only worse. With all this talk about iOS and apps, what apps are good on the iPad? One thing emphasized with tablets today is their ability to run productivity software, things akin to Microsoft Office, iWork, and other similar programs. If you can find older versions of productivity programs I think this iPad makes for a great distraction-free workplace. Here I have some apps from the iWork suite, Procreate, and Notability. It just won't be easy to transfer files off the iPad to another device. Due to its age, it no longer supports services like Google Drive, and is so old that it didn't even get AirDrop, even on iOS 9. The only way that I know of how to get your documents and other files off the iPad would be to use this transfer option when exporting files. You will then need to use either iTunes or Finder depending on what operating system you're running. Once either of the two programs are launched, you can navigate to the iPad icon and your files will be within. I think it's too much of a hassle for people who need their documents on multiple devices. Today, if you are going to use this iPad for apps, it is better suited to run games than the built-in apps on iOS, which is a bit of a no-brainer. But one application sticks out amongst the rest, and it is iBooks. This iPad, especially on iOS 6, makes for an amazing e-reader. In ideal circumstances, the battery lasts forever, and there are pretty much no distractions from social media or other bothersome applications. If you do decide to use this iPad today, I would use it as a glorified e-reader, something akin to the Nook or the Amazon Kindle. Another thing worth mentioning is the web browsing experience. While the iPad won't be the most responsive or the most reliable when it comes to web browsing, it fares pretty well for basic tasks. The Puffin web browser is the best browser for iOS 6 and it runs very well. It's even worth a shot on iOS 9. It displays web pages with minimal error and is good if you need to quickly reference something on the internet. Articles load fine from the tests I ran, and while more taxing websites don't work, YouTube surprisingly does, but it's a bit slow. Obviously, Puffin is not ideal, but if you do need a web browser, it can get a few tasks done here and there. Another way the iPad can be helpful is as a massive MP3 player. It might sound like I'm joking, but the iPad's music app is adjusted for its larger screen, which allows you to view more than other smaller devices. The iPad 2 also has a surprisingly good speaker, which is something iPods excluding the touch lack entirely. With this, it can serve as a mini jukebox. I think this setup works best on iOS 6 due to the aforementioned boost in battery life. This allows you to not have to worry about charging the iPad as often if it's really just for music playback, which is pretty light. Another great use for this iPad is as a 32-bit gaming system. The iPad's second generation can run legacy apps thanks to its 32-bit A5 CPU, and having a bigger screen than other A5 devices gives you amazing visuals for games. Unfortunately for the iPad, I don't see many other uses for it. You may be able to use it like a retro early 2010s camera, like how I said you can for the iPad's 4th generation in the last video, but it's really big and clunky and I don't see it as ideal at all. Unless you're a collector or want an iOS 9 running device larger than an iPod or an iPhone, I don't think this iPad holds up. If you're on a budget and want a device for work, the much more capable iPad Air 1st generation is available for around the same price sometimes. From my research, the iPad 2's price at worst is $50 USD, and the iPad Air 1's price at best is $50. The Air 1 has also aged, but it's far more usable than the iPad 2. It's much snappier on its final OS release of iOS 12 than the iPad 2 is on its final OS release of iOS 9. I don't know of any alternatives, but what I think is best at this price point of $40 to $60 would be getting a used Android tablet due to their far greater third-party support. If you do really want this iPad, however, I would pay about $20 USD for it. I think with its feature set, it's fully justified at that price point. And with that, we've made it to the end of the video. Please remember to like, subscribe, and comment, and I'll try my best to reply to everyone. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.